Get in the boat. Yes, Mrs. Krauss, you must.
I've always stayed with my husband, Colonel, so why should I leave him now?
Please, be sensible.
We have been living together for many years, Isidore. Where you go, I go.
Look! Oh, look!
As the most expensive movie in British film history, A Night to Remember was a media event and a sensation for audiences. But not everyone who saw the film was ready for the realism of A Night to Remember. For survivor Milvina Dean, who lost her father on Titanic, the film was too painful to watch.
I saw it with 5 other survivors then, and we all hated it, because our fathers had all gone down with it. And the first part is okay when it's starting off and everything, but it's when it's struck by the iceberg. And then I suppose we all thought about our fathers, and we were almost unhappy. We said we're never going to see another Titanic film, and we haven't done so.
British audiences and critics were unanimous in their praise for the film. But with no Hollywood stars, the film took longer to grab the attention of American audiences. But within a year of its release, A Night to Remember won a Golden Globe Award and helped introduce Titanic's story to a new generation of Americans.
I originally got involved with the Titanic when I read the book A Night to Remember by Walter Lord when I was in high school, and I was 15 years old, and it just grabbed me.
With A Night to Remember, I think it's easy to project back. It's easy for you to imagine you're on the ship. But to me, A Night to Remember will always remain, and I think the case would be for a lot of other people as well, the definitive Titanic film.
Suddenly, everyone knew the facts surrounding the disaster, and it seemed as if A Night to Remember would be the last word on Titanic, a respectful eulogy to the passengers, the ship, and the era it represented. But Titanic's journey through mainstream culture was just beginning. And as the psychedelic 60s began, the ship would find itself sailing through some strange waters. As the 1960s began, a growing optimism was sweeping the country. Anything seemed possible. And artists began to stretch the boundaries of our imagination with some decidedly offbeat accounts of the Titanic tragedy.
By the time you get to the 1960s, the Titanic became popular in a way that I don't think anyone had anticipated.
Following in the footsteps of The Twilight Zone, the popular fantasy television series One Step Beyond tantalized viewers with tales of the paranormal.
The amazing drama you're about to see is a matter of human record. You may believe it or not.
One episode told the supposedly true stories of premonitions people had before the sinking of the Titanic.
We can't go on that ship. It happened again. I dreamed.
Now, darling, I do wish you wouldn't.
I saw the sea, the cold sea. Oh. There were people struggling in the water.
Really?
Sinking, dying.
Grace.
I know you'll laugh. And I don't blame you. I was in my cabin this afternoon. I imagine it was around 4 o'clock when I heard this terrible sound.
What kind of sound?
It was a terrible grinding sound, as though the ship had suddenly struck some immovable object.
While the show recognized the tragedy of the event, One Step Beyond used the sinking to promote the show's belief in the supernatural.
Please dress warmly. Now, there's no need to panic. Just take it nice and easy.
I've never seen you do anything like this before. All of this detail in here, and... Harry, what is it? Your hands are like ice.
The water in the drawing was cold. Icy cold.
If the Titanic is not at the center of the stories, it will be a catalyst that leads us into something related at that particular time and place.
That same year, the life of one of Titanic's most colorful and flamboyant survivors evolved from a factual footnote in history to a pop culture sensation. Once renowned for her no-nonsense brand of heroism, Molly Brown's story resurfaced in 1960 as a splashy Broadway musical. The Unsinkable Molly Brown, starring Tammy Grimes, reintroduced Brown's story to the world. Opening to rave reviews, Grimes went on to receive a Tony Award for Best Actress in a Musical Comedy.
She endeared people to her as far as the audiences were concerned. They loved Molly Brown, and they loved the fact that she was an American heroine because of the Titanic. And indeed, for many, 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 many women, she was the case of a poor girl making it good.
Just 3 years after the play's Broadway run, The Unsinkable Molly Brown made its way to the silver screen in 1964. Starring Debbie Reynolds and an all-star cast, the film brought Molly's remarkable story to an even bigger audience.
I'm gonna learn to read and write. I'm gonna see what there is to see.
I guess it's like, here you eat snails, at home we step on them.
In the Molly Brown story, you really do get a challenge to the male monopoly on heroism, which you had in 1912 in particular, the idea that the true heroes of the story were the chivalrous first cabin men. In Molly Brown, you get a feminist heroine to kind of balance the scales a little bit.
But even as the public was singing along with Molly Brown, disturbing images shook the nation as they were broadcast into living rooms across the country. In response to the frustrations of the times, visionary television producer Irwin Allen began to offer viewers an escape from the reality of the nightly news. In the fantasy worlds of Irwin Allen, anything seemed possible. Even a trip back in time to sail aboard Titanic. In 1966, Allen explored his fascination with the ill-fated ship in the premiere episode of his popular series, The Time Tunnel.
Are you hurt?
I didn't look where I was going. It's a pretty big ship.
It's supposed to be the biggest ever built.
The Time Tunnel used sets and stock footage from the Fox film Titanic and told of two contemporary time travelers who visit the ship and make a vain attempt to save it from its fate.
It's very important. This ship is the Titanic.
Is that what you had to tell me?
I'm part of a scientific team in the year 1968. We've been experimenting with time displacement. I've been sent back in time to this ship, to this moment, month, and year. Captain!
Captain, I know you didn't believe my friend here, and you won't believe me. But you can believe your own eyes. The story's all here in tomorrow's paper.
Take them below. And this time, see that they say there.
They try to warn the captain.
Captain, you've got to believe me.
And they end up locked up for being crazy. And so because the captain didn't listen to these time travelers from the future, the Titanic ends up going down yet again. Instead, he should have listened to these people, and finally we could have avoided the Titanic disaster.
The Time Tunnel represented our collective desire to prevent the terrible tragedy. A modern voice echoing back through time to set history right.
I like to think that if I had been there, knowing what I know now, I could have contributed something. But those are fantasies that people play, and I think that's something that, you know, people do when they're, say, teenagers and they first get involved in the Titanic. It's like, oh, what if I had been there? And as you get older, you stop thinking along those lines, and you study the real thing and don't fantasize about, where would I have been.
In 1972, Irwin Allen would visit the mythology of Titanic again. With an all-star cast that included Gene Hackman, Shelley Winters, and Roddy McDowall, the Poseidon adventure turned a shipwreck into a big-budget thrill ride.
I've always had a visceral reaction to sea disasters. The Titanic and the Andrea Doria, they all, my family was seamen, and I have an immediate reaction to that situation.
While the Poseidon adventure would have little to do with the story of Titanic's ill-fated voyage, the similarity between Titanic and the luxury liner Poseidon wasn't lost on audiences. But by creating a fictional disaster at sea, Allen was able to give his film something the real story couldn't offer: a happy ending. An equally ambitious film released in 1980 focused exclusively on saving the ship itself. Based on Clive Cussler's best-selling novel, Raise the Titanic envisioned the ship as little more than a plot device in a high-tech spy thriller.
The story is really about a race to get this important mineral that went down supposedly with the Titanic, so that the U.S. can build a kind of Star Wars defense system against the Soviet Union. So it's really about the Cold War.
So that's where we are. We need 200 ounces of a measly mineral we can't find, and when we do find it, where is it? It's at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean.
Can't get divers down to the Titanic, which leaves us with only one choice.
And what's that?
We don't go to the mountain. The mountain comes to us.
The story's greatest moment, lifting Titanic from her watery grave, represented both man's ultimate conquering of the elements and the ultimate dream for Titanic buffs. But even spectacular special effects couldn't keep the film from sinking at the box office.
One of the biggest money-losing films in history up to that time. The financial backer of the film, Lord Grade, was reputed to have said, raise the Titanic, it would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic.
In the jaded climate of the 1970s, popular culture's take on Titanic continued to degenerate into bizarre references, far removed from the actual tragedy. But there were still those dedicated to the memory of the ship and her passengers. Founded in 1963 by Ed Kamuda, the Titanic Historical Society diligently commemorates the history of the RMS Titanic, her passengers, and her legacy.
I started corresponding with a few other people, and in one case, this fellow that I had seen in the newspaper, the New York Times, and his name was Walter Belford, and he was the chief night baker for the Titanic. And I started corresponding with him, and he died less than a year later. And when I learned that all of his materials had been thrown on the city dump, that was the time I finally decided it's time somebody formed some kind of a group to salvage all this material. And we've been at it for 35 years now.
As the Titanic Historical Society works to keep the memory of survivors alive, others began to focus on the ship itself. While the idea of raising the Titanic seemed far-fetched, a growing number of scientists believed the ship could be found. one scientist set out on an expedition that would take him 2.5 miles beneath the North Atlantic and into history. Titanic mythology began on the still surface of the North Atlantic when her stern sank from sight. But a new chapter in Titanic's legacy opened up in 1985 when Dr. Robert Ballard and his team accomplished what many thought was impossible. They found Titanic.
There was such contrast, constantly right next to violence was softness. And the wine bottles were just one example, chamber pots and things like that, just how things can survive and other things can't.
The minute we had confirmation, and then 20 minutes later when we made a pass over the bow of the ship and really knew we had the Titanic, pandemonium broke out. And I mean, bottles of champagne came out of nowhere. 2.5 miles down in the Atlantic, it's pure black. We acquire the Titanic first on sonar, and as we're moving very slowly towards it, the limited lighting that we have on a submersible will start to show a form, then a shape, and a texture, and then color. And at that point, you're there on the Titanic.
And when you think about it, I mean, they landed on the moon in 1969. They weren't able to find the Titanic till 1985. And it really was an accomplishment.
For the first time since her fateful maiden voyage, Titanic could now tell us her story, and the stories of the passengers who perished with her in 1912. Ghostly images of the rusting hulk brought back the chilling reality of her sinking, and dispelled myths that had been kept alive for years. Many thought the icy water would preserve the ship in pristine condition, but rust had eaten away much of Titanic's majestic hull.
Up to that point, Titanic was a thing of the imagination. People conceived it in different kinds of ways. It was, was it sitting there immaculately on the seabed as it had gone down in 1912? Perhaps this was in the imagination. But the discovery of the wreck certainly revealed the reality of a deteriorating shipwreck on the seabed.
The discovery also confirmed the story of young Jack Thayer Jr. and others who reported that the ship split in two as she sank into the sea.
This was dismissed by a lot of people or just fancy the ship has to go down all in one piece. That's the way ships sink. No, in fact, Jack Thayer was very, very keen-eyed for a 14-year-old and did an intriguing little drawing that, as time went by, in 1985, we now know is quite accurate.
Slowly, myths were giving way to facts. And with each new image, we were spellbound by the ship's decaying grandeur.
I remember coming upon the bow, the classic shot of the bow, right on the tip, and realizing that this is probably the most famous shipwreck in the world, and there were so many tragedies and such a great amount of loss associated with it, that it's a humbling experience.
When cameras finally penetrated the ship's hull for the first time, what before had only been imagined became a reality. Haunting images emerged from inside the wreck, taking us on a ghostly tour of the ship. After traveling down the grand stairway, a chandelier greets us in the once luxurious dining room. And littering the ocean floor, there were reminders of the passengers who lost their lives on the maiden voyage. Shoes marked the watery grave of one unlucky passenger. A copper heater sat useless in the ice-cold water. And an unopened champagne bottle waited eternally for a celebration that would never come.
All of a sudden, it was on the headlines. It was front page news again. I was thinking of the Toronto Sun with this big banner headline, Titanic found. I mean, that was probably bigger than the headline they ran when the ship sank. And it was just suddenly big news.
With the discovery of the Titanic, I caught Titanic fever all over again. I had been fascinated by the story when I was a child. And here I was in the mid-'80s, working in the field of media studies. The ship is discovered, and I come to realize that this is, among other things, a media event. It isn't just a momentous story from the past. It's living history, something that has ongoing significance.
The discovery of Titanic also served to inspire dozens of books that explored our enchantment with the wreck. Even Walter Lord was eager to follow up his definitive A Night to Remember with a new book called The Night Lives On. With interest at an all-time high, survivors were courted by the media, a living testament to the Titanic tragedy.
After 1985, we began to wonder, what was it like for the people that were actually on board? Who are they? Do they still have anything to say? And we have gone about looking for these survivors, and some of them have become media celebrities.
Well, they call me because there's nobody else to call. And quite honestly, I enjoy it. Everyone makes a fuss of me. So I enjoy it. And I go to, quite a lot of places.
When you meet a Titanic survivor, you get goosebumps because you are so close to history when you speak with them. They've achieved a celebrity status. When you see a little kid come up to a Titanic survivor and ask for an autograph, it's a very, very special moment.
Robert Ballard's discovery of Titanic led others to the wreck, hoping to mine her treasures for future generations. Although some felt the wreck was a gravesite and should be left alone, others believed that it was important to save what they could of Titanic. After securing exclusive salvage rights, RMS Titanic Incorporated began a delicate operation to retrieve what they could from the ship. Through painstaking restoration, the company was able to save everything, from clarinets to Captain Smith's aluminum megaphone. Once the artifacts had been assembled, the collection was exhibited in museums around the world, attracting record crowds eager to glimpse a piece of living history. Among the most touching pieces are the love letters of Howard Irwin, who was saved from the sinking by a twist of fate.
The trunk of Howard Irwin's was found quite by accident, and it contained the playing cards and all of the things that were dear to Howard on his trip around the world, including Pearl's love letters. He missed the boat because he got into a fight, and his best friend Harry was in charge of the luggage and ended up dying.
The artifacts were a chilling and poignant reminder of Titanic's human cargo, and no one was untouched by their power.
You cannot predict which object will affect which person. You have to just let the people have their chance. You try to frame the objects as little as possible, because the objects, in a sense, have their own voice. And what they do to people is unpredictable. As we lose these survivors, these are the only voices we'll have left. But this is not ours. It's just a voice that's echoing through time.
For artists who had been depicting the ship for years, the wreck and its artifacts brought both information and inspiration. Renowned Titanic painter Ken Marshall, who has spent a lifetime recreating the splendor of the ship, found the discovery to be a turning point in the Titanic saga.
It was tremendously exciting to me. I remember getting a little bit weepy and calling some of my friends. Some people thought that the discovery of the ship would prick the romantic bubble, that the legend would die, but it turned out to be just the opposite.
For those few lucky enough to visit the wreck themselves, nothing could match the wonder of seeing the actual ship and her artifacts firsthand.
When one of the submersibles brought up a suitcase, and the brass was as good as new, and the suitcase opened up, and there inside were two perfectly folded shirts, and the entire ship became dead quiet.
It's one thing to read about Titanic, and it's another thing to write about it, but to actually visit it was the experience of a lifetime. It was like visiting an old friend, and all of these different emotions are pulling at you in different directions, and it's like no other experience I've ever had.
Ballard's discovery of Titanic had opened up an exciting new chapter in the ship's history, and left us more curious about the lives of those who walked her decks.
The more people find out about the Titanic, the more they want to know. And because the basic story itself is about people and about people facing the greatest conflict in their life, you will always have people attracted to this story.
Beyond the science, the theories, and the controversies, Titanic was a human tale of arrogance, courage, and sacrifice. This was what the public found most compelling. And it was these stories that would inspire a new generation of authors, composers, and filmmakers to adapt the stirring tale for modern audiences. The discovery of Titanic clearly captured the imagination of the world. But there was more to this rusting hulk than artifacts and museum exhibits. This was the dawn of the virtual age, and advances in technology were helping bring the ship alive for a new generation of voyagers. One company on the cutting edge was Cyberflix, whose 1994 CD-ROM, Titanic: Adventure Out of Time, offered Titanic enthusiasts a first-hand tour of the ship on their personal computers.
The thing that computer technology allows somebody to do is to recreate a world and then allow you to walk around in it. So it's possible for you to walk down the grand staircase, turn and walk out and onto the deck and look out at a starry sky and walk down to where the lifeboats are. And you can just stand there, or you can move around, and you can go anywhere anybody could on the night of April 14th, 1912, and look, and that is what the ship looked like from that perspective on that night.
Not since her maiden voyage had anyone been able to walk the great ship's decks. And the experience brought a new understanding of what it was like for Titanic's passengers. Throughout the 1990s, new works of fiction set aboard the great ship also began popping up everywhere, as authors like Arthur C. Clarke, Jack Finney, and Danielle Steele all found new tales to tell about the fabled ship.
The general public seemed to have an insatiable desire, to read everything that's written, about Titanic. Even for me, a bookshop owner, I marvel at the sheer weight of number of publications about the Titanic.
One of the most touching and unique books to surface came from the imagination of one of Titanic's passengers. Polar, the Titanic Bear, was written by survivor Daisy Spedden in 1912 for her young son Douglas, who had slept through the cold night in his mother's arms. The handwritten manuscript told the story of the sinking through the eyes of the teddy bear that the boy traveled with. Only recently discovered by a relative, Polar the Titanic Bear now helps children around the world understand the tragedy.
A lot of schools, to my surprise, are now picking up the book and they're working into their 3rd to 5th grade curriculums. And so because of this, I get to visit schools and share Douglas's story with a whole new generation of kids. This little boy now lives on in the hearts and minds of young children everywhere.
While many of these accounts focused on real passengers, the public also found fictional characters equally compelling. In 1996, CBS aired Hallmark Entertainment's 4-hour epic miniseries, Titanic, starring Peter Gallagher, Mary Lou Henner as Molly Brown, and George C. Scott as Captain Smith. Titanic focused on the intimate relationships between passengers.
Look back on this as a real adventure. It's got everything. Action, danger, romance.
And on the class issue that created 2 separate worlds on the Ship of Dreams.
Call for assistance. We've struck an iceberg. These are the coordinates. The international call for help, CQD. Come quickly. Distress. Just that.
Open the bloody gate! I told you, first class only!
Reflecting the facts that had emerged with the discovery of the wreck, for the first time, a film showed Titanic splitting in two as she sank. The following year, veteran producer Michael David, along with composer Maury Yeston and playwright Peter Stone, launched an elaborate stage production of the tragedy as, of all things, a musical.
Sometimes the worst ideas in the world, or what seemed like the worst ideas in the world, end up being very good and very successful musicals. What's great about that story, in terms of its dramatic effect, is that its roots are in a profound irony. And audiences love irony, and irony always works on stage and always works on the screen. There's something the audience knows that the people on stage or the people on the screen don't know, and that's what animates the drama.
We saw a story that was, in some strange way, uplifting. It was about man going on after the most awful events. So it's just captivating. And people sit there in suspense, even though they know what's going to happen.
Titanic the musical proved to be a stirring triumph, winning 5 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. In 1997, director James Cameron was also putting the finishing touches on what promised to be the most historically accurate and cinematically gripping depiction of the sinking to date. Starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, Titanic would use the famed shipwreck as the backdrop for its epic love story. By the time James Cameron's Titanic premiered on December 15th of 1997, the film had taken on mythic proportions. Its $200 million budget was one of the biggest of all time, and the dazzling digital effects used to bring Titanic alive set new standards for the film industry. After opening as the #1 film in the country, Titanic held that spot for 15 weeks, longer than any other film in history. Titanic not only lived up to its name, it added fuel to an already booming Titanic market. The tragic romance had struck a chord with audiences, and fans returned to theaters again and again to relive the great ship's last moments.
I just heard that you have to see it.
It's just so full of human drama. It has all of life in it.
I liked all the special effects of how the boat was sinking and how it was made.
Oh, and the romance played a big role in the movie, I think.
I saw the movie 3 times, each with some different girls.
Titanic's appeal wasn't limited to the United States. The film filled theaters in 56 countries around the world, inspiring fanaticism wherever it went. In February of 1998, after breaking box office records around the world, Titanic was nominated for a staggering 14 Academy Awards, tying the previous record set by 1950's All About Eve. On Oscar night, Titanic went on to win 11 awards, matching the record held by Ben-Hur, including 3 for Cameron as director, producer, and editor. For survivors, however, one trip on the Titanic was enough to last a lifetime.
They've tried very hard to get me to see this movie. They even said they'd have a private showing for just me. But what's the difference? I mean, it's still the same film. Whether there's a private showing or not, it's still the same film, so it's pointless. They tried to entice me by saying a special showing for Prince Charles. Prince Charles would be there. Would I see it? And I said no, because I have no intention of seeing it, no matter who's there.
The popularity of Titanic turned props from the movie into highly coveted collector's items, prized by fans as rare pieces of motion picture history.
I initially started collecting these things because I've been a fan of Titanic for years and years and years. When Cameron made Titanic, he had these things incredibly duplicated. I mean, because I restored the elevator behind me and some of the other pieces, and the workmanship is just absolutely incredible. I can't believe this was like a movie set, because it was off the Titanic. So I said, well, I can't have original pieces, so I might as well have reasonable facsimiles. So here they are.
All of the artifacts from the movie
costumes, silverware, lamps, banisters. These things went on sale. People were buying them up, even though they were simply replicas of the original. In some sense, Titanic the movie supplanted Titanic the historical event, and it became a kind of a faux history.
Just as people of 1912 were hungry for every account of the Titanic disaster, in 1997, the public voraciously devoured all things Titanic. Artist Rick Worth created a unique rolling tribute to the ship with this roadworthy sculpture. And fashion designer Catherine Bauman even created an $80,000 jeweled purse for a one-of-a-kind Titanic gift. Inspired by the book Last Dinner on the Titanic, restaurants across the country recreated the final meals served to first-class passengers aboard Titanic before she sank.
Bon voyage! Bon voyage!
Titanic mania also swept the internet, and cyber citizens were treated to thousands of new websites that explored the science and mythology of the great ship.
So you have everything from the RMS Titanic site, Titanic Online, which is the big company doing a huge website to promote their exploration. And then you have kids around the world in school building their own sites and their own take on it.
Whether exploring the virtual world or the real world, opportunities to learn about Titanic could be found in a number of settings. Visitors aboard the now retired Queen Mary can enjoy a special exhibit of Titanic artifacts while reliving the romance of steamer travel.
Finally, there's a very dramatic way for people to appreciate what these liners are all about. So we have a great resurgence of folks coming aboard the Queen Mary saying, oh gosh, this must be what the Titanic was like. I think it helps to memorialize the event by making more people aware of that and giving sort of life and meaning to those people who lost their lives and that and to those who survived.
At 6:15 out of it, give 7. At 6:15 out of it, 700 if you wish. 700 San Francisco, not 700, give 50. At $700 to San Francisco, not anybody else, 700.
In 1998, at a Butterfield and Butterfield auction, collectors bid on photographs and personal effects owned by Harold Cotton, the wireless operator of the Carpathia, who received the distress call from Titanic.
What interests collectors is attempting to link up with that moment in time and an empathy with it and a desire to understand it and a desire, in a way, you understand yourself and maybe the future, certainly by evaluating the past.
There's something very beautiful about a plate from that period from an old ship. And I collect because I want to show people that these things exist. There's always this challenge to go out and find something that is something that not everybody has.
For those who are drawn to the wreck, an adventure touring company is planning to give people a chance to dive 2.5 miles beneath the Atlantic for a first-hand view of the ship. And for truly brave souls who want to tempt fate once again, there is Titanic 2000, an ambitious project proposed in 1998 to build a working replica of the ship. Passengers able to afford the estimated $100,000 first-class ticket price will be able to step back in time as the ship retraces Titanic's route.
If anyone ever needed confirmation that the Titanic story is alive and growing and never ever going to leave us, it's Titanic 2000. Once the Titanic gets into your life, she never ever leaves.
Titanic was a tale that bridged the barriers of time. But beyond the wreck, the film, and the mania that followed, there are still stories to be discovered and lessons to be learned about the day she sailed and the night of her sinking. The tale of Titanic is known the world over. It has captured the imagination of millions and continues to live on as vividly as when she first set sail. But in Ireland, where Titanic was built, the ship holds a special significance. And nowhere is the loss of life felt more deeply than in the small town of Cove, Ireland, where Titanic took on her last passengers. When Titanic weighed anchor here in 1912, this coastal hamlet was known as Queenstown. So small was the harbor that the 882-foot ship had to wait offshore while Titanic's last passengers were ferried to her. It is here where Irish immigrants set sail for a better life in the New World. And it is here where visitors from around the world pay homage to Titanic's passengers.
I'd say a lot of people that are coming to Ireland now on a visit are putting Cove on their itinerary because of that. You know, it's, you know, we got to go and see where the Titanic left from.
To commemorate the Titanic legacy, a heritage trail has been organized, allowing visitors to trace the path of the many men and women who booked passage to the Promised Land aboard the greatest ship of her time.
The Titanic Trail is a heritage walk that takes people in the same footsteps that immigrants walked in all those years ago, visiting the same buildings, entering the same establishments. It allows people to reach across the mists of time, as we say, and touch base with the immigrants that left.
I'm looking forward to having a lot of people come here and explain to them now what might or might not have happened on those few days before Titanic sailed.
The most touching stop on the trail is the Cove Heritage Center. Formerly a railway station, this is where immigrants arrived in Cove before booking passage to America.
The scene that would greet the visitors today is exactly the same as the scene that would have greeted the immigrants who got off the trains to board the ships here at Cove. Among the many themes that we have at Cove Heritage Centre is a wall of dedication to the people who boarded the Titanic.
From here, tourists relive the last few hours of Titanic's passengers before they embarked on their fateful voyage. But perhaps the most poignant reminder of the Titanic survivors are these photographs taken by Francis Brown before he disembarked at Queenstown, skipping the last leg of Titanic's voyage. This glimpse of the quiet moments aboard the ill-fated ship reminds us that Titanic is first and foremost a human tragedy.
People wanted to see the real Titanic, and then even after they'd gone to the movie, they wanted to see how the creation compared with the reality. They wanted even to see the real people.
Decades ago, the people of this coastal village watched as Titanic sailed into history, filled with dreams of a new world. 4 days later, the voyage ended. In 1998, the people of Cove commemorated the memory of the dead with a wreath-laying ceremony in the harbor. Perhaps the saddest reminder of the lives lost is the cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where 150 unclaimed victims of the disaster were buried. This is the final resting place of Titanic's poorest passengers, whose families lacked the means to bring them home. But while few of these bodies have been claimed, none of the dead will ever be forgotten. For decades, the International Ice Patrol, who watch over the waters of the North Atlantic for icebergs, has laid a wreath over the watery grave.
1,571 men, women, and children went down to the sea. Oh, God, have mercy upon those unfortunate souls.
This annual memorial ensures that the memory of Titanic's passengers will never be forgotten. This is a holy shrine for some, and 3 survivors have even chosen to have their ashes scattered over the site, returning to loved ones who weren't able to escape their fate. It was in these waters on a cold night in April that Harold Cotton intercepted Titanic's plea for help, And through his bravery and diligence, over 700 people survived the greatest maritime disaster of its day. It is their voices that have kept Titanic alive for decades. Because without them, Titanic's remarkable tale would have vanished beneath the waves. Like Gettysburg or Arlington Cemetery, Titanic is yet another graveyard that has become a cultural marker, a chilling reminder of the tests of courage that these landmarks represent.
The Titanic stays with us because it's timely, not because it's timeless, because we can keep finding new ways to tell the story.
The Titanic now has become a global legacy. People all over the world are fascinated by it. All of us can identify it in some way. Rich, poor, there's something in it for everyone.
We live in a time period today where human beings are not often shown on the nightly news to be their very best. And during the 2 hours and 40 minutes that Titanic took to sink, you have some amazing stories of selflessness and devotion and love and courage.
With each retelling of her tale, the story of Titanic continues to fascinate us, terrify us, and enlighten us.
Fundamentally, I think it's a story about the mystery of the human condition. In a way, it's about the enduring relationship between humanity, machine, and implacable nature.
No matter what part of her story captures us, Titanic will remain alive as long as artists, authors, and filmmakers continue to tell her story. From the jittery newsreels of her maiden voyage to the spectacular recreations of her sinking, we find a lesson to be learned from the great ship and from the more than 2,000 passengers who lived and died aboard her.
When the Titanic sinks, that's a disaster. But when the Titanic sinks and takes 1,500 people with her, that's a tragedy. And it strikes home to every one of us because we realize they weren't all that different than we are.
In an age when we are bombarded by images of death and disaster every day, Titanic continues to remind us that behind each headline is a human face with a story to be told and a life to be remembered.